Hello and welcome to the second video in our series on the history of the United States Navy Armed Guard. Episode 2 will explore the prelude to World War II and the rebirth of the United States Navy Armed Guard. Through the 1930s, the Japanese Empire expands its reach in the east, and Germany gobbles up lands in Europe to create a greater German nation. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Joint Planning Committee, the future Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Joint Army and Navy Board, developed a number of color-coded war plans to outline potential United States strategies for a variety of hypothetical war scenarios. War Plan Orange, with Japan as the national foe, was the longest and most detailed. It was revised 9 times between 1919 and 1938. War Plan Orange, as well as the other color-coded plans, was officially withdrawn in 1939 in favor of the Rainbow Plan series. Spurred by the outbreak of war in Europe and the resulting dominant German strategic position, these plans were developed to meet the threat of a two-ocean war against multiple enemies. On September 1, 1939, Germany crosses the Polish border and invades Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany. World War II formally begins. On September 3, 1939, President Franklin Roosevelt addresses the country via a radio address, deploring the Germans' actions of war while laying the blame on Nazi aggression. The broadcast emphasized the neutrality of the United States, at the same time fanning ill will towards Hitler's efforts to dominate Europe. The Neutrality Act, passed in 1937, had given President Roosevelt some flexibility in supporting resistance towards Germany. The Neutrality Act allowed the sale of arms to Great Britain and France on a cash-and-carry basis. Purchasing nations would pay immediately for the arms and would arrange for their transport. On September 4, 1939, 3 days after Germany's invasion of Poland and all-out war in Europe, United States Navy air and surface neutrality patrols were initiated in the Atlantic. The much lesser-known neutrality patrols were also carried out in the far Pacific by Naval Air Patrol assets, mainly based at Cavite, Philippines, located in the Manila Bay Area, the home port of the United States Asiatic Fleet. The neutrality patrols would continue into the final months of 1941. On June 22, 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared a national emergency and began American efforts to control shipping in the Western Hemisphere. The emergency shipbuilding program begins in late 1940. Before the United States entered World War II, the U.S. was engaging in defense preparations with an eye toward the war raging in Europe. January through March of 1941, the Armed Guard program slowly developed to meet the needs of a possible two-front war and the addition of numerous newly constructed merchant vessels, all requiring armed protection. At this time, few precedents could be called upon for guidance on setting up a new Armed Guard program. The first version of the Armed Guard to see action was established during World War I. Merchant ships carried Navy personnel and guns. However, the World War I program was small, with approximately 384 armed merchant ships, compared with the arming of approximately 6,200 ships in World War II, approximately 16 times greater in magnitude than the World War I program. The World War I program offered little guidance for the massive volume of merchant vessels to come. Some additional reason for not following the World War I plans was due to the fact that most of the records of World War I were not readily available or lost entirely. The British have been arming their merchant ships since mid-1938, but the British defensively equipped merchant ships program was so radically different from the United States program that it could not be followed as a pattern. The United States did almost nothing to prepare for the arming of merchant ships prior to April 15, 1941. At this time, the United States was operating under the Neutrality Act of 1939. Section 6 of the 1939 Neutrality Act prohibited the arming of American merchant vessels. The training of personnel to man merchant ship guns began approximately in April 1941, and in the coming months, plans were developed to make the necessary preliminary installations for ultimate armament and to install guns when the Neutrality Act was repealed. This preliminary planning was useful. No one at the time correctly estimated the monumental task ahead. Early on, there was no clear organization for handling the problem. Too many divisions in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations were mixed up in the problem. Central direction was lacking for many months. Up to January 31, 1942, the program lacked central direction. The Arming Merchant Ships section was established in the Fleet Maintenance Division of the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations to rectify this issue. The training of new armed guards commenced approximately on the 15th of April 1941. Nearly 200 reserve officers received elementary ordnance and gunnery instruction at the Naval Academy in the summer of 1941. The decision to begin arming ships and the Navy Department's scope of this issue was assumed by a casual manner. The underestimation of the Navy Department's total number of armed merchant ships to come was not fully appreciated. Prior to the development of modern radar, sighting enemy ships and airplanes was all performed visually. New merchant ships would be built with sky lookout stations for spotting the enemy from a board ship. But sky lookout stations were not very useful on merchant ships, especially in view of the limited naval personnel available to defend the ship and stand watches. On September 25, 1941, Chief of Naval Operations informed the Bureau of Navigation that 200 officers and 1,800 armed guards should be trained by January 15, 1942. The plan was based on the assignment of one officer, one petty officer, and 7 seamen to be assigned to each merchant ship. It was assumed that 4 seamen would be needed to man the machine guns, 3 seamen, and a petty officer for the larger caliber gun. At this early stage of planning, the Navy was already planning to use merchant seamen in handling ammunition rolls and to furnish armed guards only for the key positions. Training was to include all stations and was to enable the armed guard to fire machine guns and to handle larger weapons for anti-aircraft, barrage, and surface firing. The defense of the merchant ship was a responsibility of the armed guard, commanding officer, and his Navy gunners, not the ship's merchant captain or merchant crew. The Naval Reserve Armory Building at 52nd Street and 1st Avenue in Brooklyn, New York, was commissioned as a Navy receiving station on May 20, 1941. The station was used to accommodate the crews of British vessels undergoing repairs in local shipyards. On October 15, 1941, the Bureau of Navigation established one of the first armed guard school at the section base, Little Creek, Virginia. The school at Little Creek had very modest beginnings. The original staff consisted of 4 retired chief gunner's mates, but the staff expanded rapidly. The first class, consisting of 23 officers and 184 men. By November 3, 1941, the estimated needs for arming about 275 ships in 4 months were increased to 280 officers and 2,300 men. On November 10, 1941, the receiving station in Brooklyn, New York, was officially designated by the Bureau of Navigation as the Armed Guard Center for the Atlantic Coast. November 14, 1941, Washington, D.C. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, receives an urgent phone call from the President. "Harold, this is FDR. I've got good news. Congress has just revised the Neutrality Acts. We can arm the merchant ships at last." The Admiral breathed a welcomed sigh of relief. America wasn't in the shooting war yet, but at last American merchant ships would be able to defend themselves. Perhaps the tragic sinking of the SS Robin Moore in May by Ulrich Greff's U-69 would prove to be a blessing in disguise. Apparently, it had opened Congress's eyes to what was taking place on the high seas. Stark pressed the buzzer on his desk. "Get me Commander Ed Clevey at once, and an inventory of every gun not already aboard a warship." A telephone call from Franklin Delano Roosevelt put into motion a manpower force that in a matter of weeks would become the U.S. Naval Armed Guard. It was a bold move for a country not at war, but one not taken a moment too soon. Each morning newspaper headlines blared the awful truth that Britain, America's sole unvanquished ally in Europe, was being slowly strangled by Hitler's far-ranging U-boats. Unless the undersea killer's chokehold on the shipment of food, weapons, and supplies was broken, it was a certainty the English and Russians would be defeated. Finding the necessary number of guns proved to be an extraordinary task, since the fleet buildup begun in 1940 took priority over everything available. But if finding guns posed a problem, training gunners to operate them proved even more difficult. Merchant Marine seamen, despite the coaxing of the Navy and even their own National Maritime Union president, Joseph Curran, refused attempts to man guns, even if supervised by naval officers and gunners' mates. This would only prompt U-boats to increase attacks, the seamen staunchly argued. If the Navy wanted guns, then it was up to them to man them. For the November 15, 1941 Bureau of Navigation Directive, the Armed Guard Center at Treasure Island was established and opened on December 19, 1941. It was the intention of the Navy Department that the center should perform the same functions performed by the other centers, no more and no less. On November 17th, the Bureau of Navigation directed that personnel in the naval districts who had been trained for armed guard duty should be assigned to Little Creek, Virginia, or San Diego, California, for further training, along with men receiving their first training for armed guard duties. These men were then to be transferred to the Armed Guard Centers at New York and Treasure Island in San Francisco, California, for assignment to merchant ships. On 18 November, the day after the repeal of the Neutrality Act, orders went out from the Chief of Naval Operations to begin arming ships according to the directive of 27 October, except for ships operating in the Pacific west of Hawaii. On November 18, 1941, the Armed Guard Center, Atlantic, Brooklyn, New York, received the first Armed Guard officers and men from Little Creek, Virginia. On December 2, 1941, the first Navy Armed Guard crew was placed on board the SS Dunboyne. A crew of 7 armed guards were assigned to the ship, which was headed for Murmansk, Russia. Sunday, December 7, 1941, the Japanese Empire attacks the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The United States formally enters World War II. Thanks for watching the activities and actions leading up to the U.S. Navy Armed Guard entry into World War II. Please look for my next video. Like this video and hit the subscribe for my channel on the U.S. Navy Armed Guard. Look for our Facebook group, U.S. Navy Armed Guard WW2 Group. Please visit the Armed Guard website at www.armed-guard.net. If you are visiting the Baltimore, Maryland area, please plan a visit to the United States Navy National Armed Guard Museum on board the Liberty ship, the SS John W. Brown. If you're unable to make it to Baltimore, please consider a donation to Project Liberty Ship, SS John W. Brown, at this link.